Within an hour, the incident was trending on every social media platform. Video clips, captured on phones by audience members and leaked by people who'd seen the footage, spread like wildfire. The hashtag started immediately. Some people used supportive phrases praising Keanu for setting boundaries. Others used critical ones, calling him privileged or accusing him of avoiding important conversations. The internet, as it tended to do, immediately divided into camps. The first official statement came from The View during their next segment. When they came back from commercial, the energy on set was noticeably different. Whoopi addressed the situation head-on, her professionalism evident even though you could tell she was deeply affected by what had happened. "As you all just witnessed," she began, her voice steady, "our guest Keanu Reeves chose to leave the interview. We want to respect his decision while also acknowledging that the conversation became more intense than anyone anticipated." She continued carefully, walking a tightrope between defending her show and respecting Keanu. "We ask tough questions here. That's part of our job, but we also want our guest to feel comfortable and respected. If Keanu felt that didn't happen today, we take that seriously." You could see the other hosts had varying reactions to this statement. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked like they wanted to say more but were holding back. The discussion that followed was predictably divided. Some hosts doubled down on their position that public figures had a responsibility to address important issues. Others seemed more reflective, wondering if they'd pushed too hard. The audience questions they took were equally split, with some people supporting Keanu's walkout and others criticizing it. Meanwhile, outside that studio, the story was taking on a life of its own. News outlets picked it up immediately. Entertainment shows started covering it. Think pieces began appearing online before the day was even over. Everyone had an opinion about what had happened and what it meant. Keanu's representatives released a brief statement that afternoon. It was characteristically measured and didn't throw blame at anyone. Keanu Reeves values respectful dialogue and appreciates the opportunity to discuss his work. While today's interview took an unexpected direction, he wishes everyone at The View well and hopes viewers will enjoy his upcoming film. That was it. No dramatic accusations, no lengthy explanations, no attempts to shape the narrative beyond acknowledging what had happened. It was so perfectly Keanu that it almost made people more interested in the story. In an age where every celebrity had a team working overtime to control their image, his refusal to engage in that game felt revolutionary. Social media exploded with reactions. Actors, directors, and other celebrities weighed in, some publicly, others in private messages that later leaked. A surprising number of people in the entertainment industry expressed support for Keanu, sharing their own stories of feeling ambushed in interviews or pressured to take public stances they weren't comfortable with. The conversation expanded beyond just this one incident to broader questions about celebrity culture and the expectations placed on public figures. But there was significant criticism too. Activists and commentators argued that Keanu's walkout represented exactly the kind of privilege they'd been trying to get him to acknowledge. They pointed out that marginalized people didn't have the luxury of opting out of political conversations, that their very existence was politicized. The argument was that someone in Keanu's position had a moral obligation to use his platform, and his refusal to do so was itself a harmful choice. The debate played out across countless platforms. Twitter threads stretched into the hundreds of responses. YouTube commentators made video essays analyzing every moment of the exchange. Reddit threads dissected the body language and tone of everyone involved. Facebook became a battleground of friends and family members arguing about celebrity responsibility, with many people using the incident as a proxy for larger political disagreements. What was particularly interesting was how the incident seemed to cut across typical political lines. Some conservatives praised Keanu for not bowing to what they saw as progressive pressure to perform activism. Some progressives defended him by pointing out that he'd spent decades quietly supporting progressive causes. Some people on both sides criticized him, either for not doing enough or for not respecting the interview format. The fact that people across the spectrum were taking different positions showed how complex the situation actually was. The next day, The View addressed the situation again. This time they'd had a night to think about it, to read the reactions, to consider their approach. The conversation was more nuanced. Whoopi spoke about respect and boundaries, about the difference between asking tough questions and making guests feel attacked. She acknowledged that maybe they'd crossed a line, even if unintentionally. But not all the hosts agreed with that assessment. One argued passionately that they'd simply been doing their jobs, asking the questions viewers wanted answered. Another suggested that Keanu's reaction was disproportionate, that he could have handled the disagreement without walking out. The discussion became a microcosm of the larger debate happening across the country about discourse, boundaries, and respect in polarized times. What struck many observers was that neither side was entirely wrong. Yes, journalists and interviewers should be able to ask tough questions. But yes, guests should also be able to set boundaries about what they're comfortable discussing. Yes, people with platforms have opportunities to make positive change. But yes, there are many ways to contribute to society beyond public political statements. The incident highlighted tensions that didn't have easy resolutions. In the weeks that followed, the story gradually faded from the daily news cycle, as all stories eventually do. But it left a lasting impact. Several talk shows reportedly changed their pre-interview processes, having more explicit conversations with guests about topics that would be covered. Some celebrities became more cautious about appearing on panel shows known for confrontational discussions. The incident became a reference point in media ethics courses and discussions about celebrity culture. Keanu himself never spoke about it publicly beyond that initial brief statement. Friends and colleagues who knew him said he'd moved on, focusing on his work and his private life as he always had. He didn't hold grudges, didn't badmouth The View or its hosts in private conversations. He'd made his point by walking out, and that was enough for him. His film, the one he'd been there to promote, became one of the biggest hits of the year. Interestingly, post-mortem analysis suggested the controversy might have actually helped its box office performance. People who might not have paid attention to another action movie were curious about the actor at the center of this cultural conversation. The film's themes about individual integrity and standing up for what you believe in resonated differently given what had happened. Years later, people still referenced the incident. It became shorthand for discussions about celebrity activism, interview ethics, and the increasingly blurred lines between entertainment and political discourse. Film students studied it as an example of how quickly an interview could go wrong. Communication professors used it to teach about setting and respecting boundaries. It became one of those cultural moments that meant different things to different people, but that everyone seemed to remember. For Keanu, it became another layer in his already complex public persona. To some, it confirmed what they'd always believed about him, that he was a principled person who lived according to his values rather than public expectations. To others, it complicated their view of him, making them question whether his famous niceness extended to situations where he was challenged. Most people, though, fell somewhere in between, seeing it as a human moment where someone reached their limit and acted accordingly. The hosts of The View continued their show, continuing to ask tough questions of their guests. But those who worked on the show said the incident had an impact, even if subtle. There was more awareness about the line between probing interview and interrogation, more consideration of how multiple hosts talking at once could feel overwhelming to a single guest. It wasn't that they stopped asking difficult questions, but they became more mindful of how they asked them. In the end, what happened that day in the studio became a mirror that people held up to their own beliefs about fame, responsibility, discourse, and respect. The fact that reasonable people could watch the same footage and come to completely different conclusions said something important about the times we lived in. There were no easy answers, no clear villains or heroes, just people trying to navigate an increasingly complex landscape where every interaction could become a national conversation and every choice carried weight beyond what anyone intended. Keanu went back to his life, riding his motorcycle through Los Angeles, showing up on film sets, being kind to crew members, supporting causes he believed in, and maintaining the privacy that had always been so important to him. The incident didn't change who he was. It just revealed more clearly than ever that he knew exactly who he was and wasn't willing to compromise that for anyone, even when the cameras were rolling and the whole world was watching. And perhaps that more than anything else that happened that day was what resonated with so many people. In a world that constantly demanded performance, explanation, and public declaration, there was something powerful about someone simply saying no and meaning it. Whether you agreed with his choice or not, you had to respect the conviction behind it. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. though it probably took less than 30 seconds from start to finish. Keanu reached up and carefully removed his lapel microphone. The movement was deliberate, calm, without any dramatic flourish. He wasn't ripping it off in anger or making a show of his departure. He simply unclipped it, laid it gently on the arm of his chair, and stood up. The studio went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Every person in that audience, every crew member, every host, suddenly understood what was happening. This wasn't a commercial break. This wasn't part of the show. Keanu Reeves was leaving. "I appreciate your time," he said, his voice quiet but clear enough for everyone to hear. The microphone on the table was still picking him up. "Whoopi, thank you for the invitation. I'm sorry this didn't go the way either of us hoped." Whoopi's face registered shock, then something that looked like sadness. She'd convinced him to come, had vouched for the show, and now it was falling apart in the worst possible way. "Keanu, please," she started, reaching out slightly. "Don't go. We can talk about the movie, we can—" But Keanu shook his head gently. "I came here in good faith," he continued. And now he was addressing the entire panel, though his tone remained respectful. "I came to talk about work I'm proud of, with people I thought would be interested in having an actual conversation. But this isn't a conversation. This is something else entirely, and I don't think it's the right environment for me." One of the hosts tried to protest. "We're just asking questions that matter to people." "You're asking questions designed to put me in an impossible position," Keanu interrupted, still calm but firm. "Every answer I give gets twisted into something else. If I share my views, I'm being political. If I don't share them, I'm being privileged. There's no winning here, and I don't want to play this game." The audience was completely frozen. Some people had their hands over their mouths in shock. Others were already pulling out their phones, fingers flying across screens. The producers in the control room were probably having a collective heart attack, trying to figure out whether to cut to commercial or let this historic moment play out. Joy Behar made one more attempt. "Come on, Keanu, we're all adults here. We can have a disagreement without—" "This isn't a disagreement," Keanu said, and for the first time there was real emotion breaking through his measured composure. "A disagreement is when two people with different views discuss them respectfully. This is 5 people talking over one person, demanding he justify his entire approach to life, and not accepting any answer he gives. That's not dialogue. That's an interrogation." Sarah Haynes looked genuinely upset. "We didn't mean for it to feel that way." Keanu's expression softened slightly. "I believe you. I don't think anyone here has bad intentions. But the result is the same. I feel ambushed and I feel disrespected. And I think the best thing I can do for everyone is to leave before this gets any worse." He turned to the audience, and his demeanor shifted again. This was the Keanu they recognized, the gentle, kind person who'd been charming them just 20 minutes earlier. "Thank you all for being here," he said directly to them. "I'm sorry you had to see this. I hope you enjoy the rest of the show." Then he did something remarkable. He went down the line of hosts, shaking each of their hands, not in a sarcastic or aggressive way, but genuinely, as if to say there were no hard feelings even though he was leaving. Some of them seemed too stunned to respond properly, awkwardly taking his hand. Others tried to use the moment to make one more appeal for him to stay. When he got to Whoopi, he paused longer. "I'm really sorry," he said quietly, though the microphone still caught it. "I know this puts you in a difficult position." Whoopi's eyes looked glassy, like she might cry. "I'm the one who's sorry," she said back. "This isn't what I promised you." The exchange between them was so human, so real, that it cut through all the tension and controversy. Here were 2 professionals who respected each other, caught in a situation that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. For just a moment, the audience seemed to collectively hold its breath, wondering if maybe, just maybe, Whoopi could convince him to stay. But Keanu had made his decision. He gave Whoopi's hand a final squeeze, nodded once more to the audience, and began walking toward the side of the stage. His movement was unhurried, dignified. He wasn't storming off in a rage. He was simply leaving a situation that had become untenable. The cameras followed him, unsure what else to do. The director in the booth was probably screaming conflicting instructions. Cut away, stay on him, go to the hosts. Every instinct in television production said to cut to commercial, to protect the show, to salvage what could be salvaged. But this was also compelling television, the kind of unscripted moment that rarely happened anymore in a world where everything was focus grouped and pre-planned. As Keanu reached the edge of the stage, one of the hosts called out, "You're just gonna run away? That's your response?" Keanu stopped. For a second, it looked like he might not turn around, might just keep walking. But then he did turn, and his expression was a mixture of sadness and disappointment. "I'm not running away," he said clearly. "I'm making a choice about what environments I'm willing to participate in. That's not weakness. That's self-respect." With that, he stepped off the stage and disappeared into the wings. The camera held on the empty space where he'd been standing for a beat too long. Then finally, mercifully, cut to the stunned faces of the hosts. No one seemed to know what to say. Whoopi was clearly upset, staring at the spot where Keanu had exited. Joy looked defensive, as if preparing to justify what had happened. The others wore expressions ranging from shock to something that might have been regret. The audience's energy was chaotic. Some people looking angry, others sympathetic, many just confused about what they'd witnessed. Finally, a producer's voice came through someone's earpiece and Whoopi snapped into professional mode. "We're going to take a quick break," she announced, her voice strained. "We'll be right back." The second they cut to commercial, chaos erupted. On stage, the hosts immediately began a heated discussion among themselves, voices raised, fingers pointing. In the audience, people were talking loudly, pulling out phones, texting and tweeting, and recording video messages about what they'd just seen. Producers rushed onto the stage, trying to figure out damage control. Stage managers checked equipment, as if maybe a technical problem could somehow explain what had happened. Backstage, Keanu had walked straight to his team, who met him with a mixture of concern and anger on his behalf. His publicist was already on the phone, probably with the network, probably with his management, already beginning the process of controlling the narrative that was about to explode across every media platform in existence. But Keanu himself seemed remarkably calm. He'd done what he felt he needed to do. He'd set a boundary, enforced it, and left with his dignity intact. Whether the public would see it that way remained to be seen. But in that moment, in the quiet of the backstage area, away from cameras and questions and demands, he looked like someone who'd stood up for himself and felt okay about it. Security escorted him out a back entrance to avoid the growing crowd of fans and press that had somehow already materialized outside the main studio doors. News traveled fast in the age of social media, and what had happened inside that studio was already starting to make waves across the internet. By the time Keanu reached his motorcycle, his phone was blowing up with messages from friends, colleagues, and reporters, all wanting to know the same thing. What happened in there? He didn't check any of them. He put on his helmet, started his bike, and rode away from the studio, leaving behind a media firestorm that was only just beginning. The silence in the studio stretched longer than was comfortable for television. Every eye was on Keanu, waiting to see how he'd respond to being put on the spot about a contentious political issue. The host who'd asked the question sat forward in her chair, expectant. The others watched with varying expressions, some seeming uncomfortable with the directness, others appearing eager to hear his answer. Keanu took a breath. When he spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "I appreciate the question, but I'm going to have to respectfully decline to answer it. My personal political views are just that, personal. I don't believe that my platform as an actor obligates me to tell people how to think about complex issues." It was a measured response, delivered without hostility, but it clearly wasn't the answer they wanted. The host who'd asked pressed further. "But don't you think that silence is a form of privilege? That people who are affected by these issues don't have the luxury of staying quiet?" Keanu's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I don't think choosing not to broadcast my opinions publicly is the same as staying quiet. I have conversations with people I trust, I educate myself, I contribute to causes I believe in, but I've never felt that performing my beliefs for cameras was authentic or helpful." Another host jumped in, her tone sharp. "Performing? Is that what you think activism is?" "Performing? That's not what I said." Keanu's voice remained level, but you could hear an edge creeping in. "I think there's a difference between genuine activism and the expectation that every public figure needs to make statements on every issue. Some people are incredible activists. That's their calling, and I respect it immensely. But that's not my role." Whoopi tried to intervene, sensing how badly this was going off the rails. "I think what Keanu is saying is that there are different ways to make a difference, and not everyone has to do it the same way." But the other hosts weren't ready to let it go. They'd caught a scent of controversy, and daytime television thrived on controversy. One of them brought up specific instances where celebrities had spoken out and made real change happen. Another cited examples of people using their platforms to raise awareness for important causes. The implication was clear. Keanu was somehow failing in his responsibility by not doing the same. "I've been doing this for over 30 years, Keanu said, and now there was real frustration in his voice. "I've tried to live with integrity, to treat people well, to contribute positively to the world in the ways that feel authentic to me. I don't understand why that's not enough. Why does it have to be public? Why does it have to be performative?" "Because people need to see it," one host shot back. "Young people need role models who stand for something. Your silence can be interpreted as not caring." Keanu shook his head slowly. "I can't control how people interpret my silence. What I can control is living according to my values. I give millions to children's hospitals. I support cancer research because people I loved died from cancer. I've helped crew members pay for medical treatments. I've bought houses for people who needed them. I don't talk about these things because I don't think kindness should be a press opportunity." The audience began to applaud, but the hosts talked over it. The conversation was spiraling now. Multiple people trying to make their points simultaneously. It had ceased being an interview and become a debate, with Keanu as the reluctant participant in an argument he'd never wanted to have. "But that's charity, not activism," another host insisted. "We're talking about using your voice for systemic change." "And I'm telling you that's not my strength," Keanu replied, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I'm an actor. I'm good at my job. I work hard at it. I treat people with respect. I try to be kind. Why isn't that enough? Why do I have to be a political spokesperson to be considered a good person?" The back and forth continued, getting more heated with each exchange. The hosts were talking over each other now, each trying to make their point. Some argued that fame came with responsibility. Others suggested that Keanu's reluctance indicated he was on the wrong side of issues. One even implied that his desire for privacy was itself a political statement. Through it all, Keanu sat there looking increasingly like someone who'd walked into a trap. His responses remained measured, but his body language screamed discomfort. He'd uncross and recross his arms. He'd look toward Whoopi as if hoping she'd put a stop to this. He'd glance toward the wings where his team was surely watching, probably as horrified as he was. "This isn't what I agreed to," he said finally, cutting through the crosstalk. "I came here to talk about my work, to have a conversation. This feels like an ambush." "It's not an ambush," one host protested. "These are just questions. Important questions. Important to you," Keanu countered. "I understand you have a show to do and you want engagement and controversy gets views. I get it. But I'm not going to be the person who gives you that controversy by saying something inflammatory or taking a stance I'm not comfortable taking publicly." The atmosphere in the studio had shifted completely. The audience, which had been applauding and laughing earlier, now sat in uncomfortable silence. Some people were looking at their phones, probably already tweeting about what they were witnessing. Others were whispering to their neighbors, clearly unsure what to make of the situation unfolding before them. Sunny Hostin leaned forward, her expression serious. "Keanu, I think you're missing the point. This isn't about controversy. It's about accountability. You benefit from a system that gives you incredible privilege. Don't you think you owe something back?" "I think I've given quite a lot back," Keanu said quietly. "Just not in the way you're demanding I give it." Another host jumped back in. "But what about your fans? Don't they deserve to know where you stand?" "My fans know where I stand," Keanu said, and his voice had taken on a harder edge. "I stand for kindness, for treating people well, for putting in the work, for showing up, for being reliable, for helping when I can. If that's not enough, if people need me to perform my politics on television to respect me, then maybe I'm not the person they think I am." Joy Behar tried a different approach. "Look, Keanu, we're not trying to make you uncomfortable, but you have to understand in today's world, everything is political. Choosing not to engage is itself a political choice." Keanu closed his eyes briefly as if gathering himself. "I understand that's how many people see it. I really do. But I disagree. I think it's possible to be a good person, to contribute positively to the world, without turning every aspect of your life into a public political statement. And I think the demand that everyone must engage in that way is exhausting and counterproductive. The hosts weren't backing down. They'd moved from specific political questions to broader philosophical debates about celebrity, responsibility, and the nature of public life. It was the kind of conversation that might have been interesting in a different context, between willing participants, but this wasn't that. This was an actor who'd come to promote a movie being subjected to an impromptu interrogation about his entire worldview. Alyssa tried to redirect. What about your John Wick character? He stands up for what's right, fights against injustice. Isn't that political? He's a fictional character, Keanu said, the exasperation clear now. In a fictional world, with fictional stakes. That's the point of movies. They let us explore ideas and emotions in safe spaces. But I'm not John Wick. I'm just a guy who plays him. The conversation continued to circle, the hosts seeming unable or unwilling to accept Keanu's position. They brought up other celebrities who spoke out. They cited polls about what young people expected from public figures. They discussed the concept of using privilege for good, as if Keanu hadn't spent decades quietly doing exactly that. Finally, Keanu held up his hand. It was a simple gesture, not aggressive, just a clear signal that he was done. I think we've exhausted this topic, he said firmly. Can we please talk about something else, or are we finished here? The question hung in the air. Whoopi jumped in quickly, trying to salvage things. Of course. Let's talk about your co-stars. Tell us about working with... But before she could finish, another host cut her off with one more question. One more push. One more demand that Keanu justify his approach to fame and responsibility. That's when something shifted in Keanu's expression. It wasn't anger exactly. It was more like resignation mixed with resolve. He'd reached a decision. The applause was thunderous as Keanu walked onto the stage. He moved with that easy, unhurried grace that made him seem both approachable and somehow otherworldly at the same time. The audience was on their feet and he looked genuinely touched by the reception. He waved, smiled that slightly shy smile of his, and took his seat next to Whoopi. Welcome. Whoopi beamed at him, and you could see the real affection there. These two had history, mutual respect built over years in the industry. We've been trying to get you here for so long. Keanu laughed, a warm, genuine sound. I know. I'm terrible about these things. But I'm really happy to be here. And you could tell he meant it. In that moment, everything felt right. The chemistry was good. The energy was positive, and the audience was completely engaged. The first 15 minutes went beautifully. They talked about his new film, and Keanu lit up when discussing the project. He wasn't one of those actors who promoted things with hollow enthusiasm. When he cared about something, you could hear it in every word. He talked about the months of training he'd done, the bruises and pulled muscles, learning new fighting techniques at an age when most people would be taking it easier. You did your own stunts again? Joy Behar asked, shaking her head in amazement. Aren't you worried about getting hurt? Keanu shrugged in that modest way of his. The stunt team is incredible. They make me look way better than I actually am. And honestly, doing the stunts yourself, it changes the scene. The camera captures something real, something physical. I think audiences can feel the difference. Inside, the security team had been briefed to keep things low-key. No fuss. No special treatment that would make him uncomfortable. When he walked through the doors, he was dressed casually in dark jeans and a simple jacket. His hair was a bit tousled, and he carried a motorcycle helmet under one arm. Of course, he'd ridden his bike to the studio. That was so perfectly him. The production coordinator who met him at the entrance had been nervous all morning. She'd practiced her greeting, planned out the route to the green room, prepared answers to questions he might ask. But within 30 seconds of meeting him, all that anxiety melted away. Keanu shook her hand warmly, thanked her for having him, and asked about her morning. Not in that fake way celebrities sometimes do, but like he genuinely cared about the answer. As they walked through the corridor toward the makeup room, something remarkable happened. Every crew member they passed, Keanu acknowledged. The lighting technician adjusting cables overhead got a wave. The intern carrying coffee got a good morning and a smile. When they passed the costume department, he stopped to compliment someone on their jacket. It wasn't performative. There were no cameras rolling. This was just who he was when no one was watching. The makeup artist assigned to him that morning had been doing television for 20 years, and she'd seen hundreds of celebrities come through her chair. Most barely acknowledged her existence. Some were actively rude, treating her like a piece of furniture. When Keanu walked in, he introduced himself as if she might not know who he was, asked her name, and actually remembered it throughout their time together. They chatted about everything from motorcycles to her daughter's college applications. By the time she finished, she was telling everyone backstage that he was the nicest person she'd ever worked with. Meanwhile, on the main stage, the View hosts were preparing for the show. They'd done their research on Keanu, reviewing his filmography, his quotes from past interviews, the tragic losses he'd experienced in his personal life. They knew viewers loved him, and they wanted to do right by him. The questions had been carefully prepared, balancing entertainment value with respect for his boundaries. Or at least that was the plan. Whoopi Goldberg, the show's veteran moderator, had been particularly excited about this booking. She'd worked with Keanu years ago and remembered him as a consummate professional. She'd actually been the one who'd helped convince him to appear, calling him personally to assure him it would be a comfortable, respectful conversation. He'd trusted her word. The other hosts were equally enthusiastic, though for different reasons. For some, it was the chance to interview one of Hollywood's most enigmatic figures. For others, it was an opportunity to dig into weightier topics with someone who had a reputation for thoughtfulness. The show had been increasingly focused on mixing entertainment with social commentary, and they saw Keanu as someone who could bridge both worlds. The studio audience began filing in around 8:30. The energy was electric. People had lined up hours early hoping for tickets, and those who got them knew they were lucky. This wasn't like seeing a typical celebrity guest. This was Keanu Reeves, the man who'd captured hearts across generations, from the Bill and Ted movies to The Matrix to John Wick. He represented something rare in Hollywood, genuine authenticity. Back in the green room, Keanu sat quietly, reviewing some notes about his latest project. He'd be talking about a new action film he'd poured his heart into, working with a director he admired and a stunt team he'd trained with for months. This was what he wanted to focus on: the work, the craft, the people who'd helped bring the story to life. He believed in promoting projects by honoring everyone involved, not by making himself the center of attention. A production assistant knocked gently on his door. 5 minutes until showtime. Keanu took a deep breath, not from nerves but from the simple practice of centering himself. He'd done hundreds of interviews over his decades-long career, but he never took them for granted. Each one was a chance to connect with people who'd supported his work, and he took that responsibility seriously. As he stood and headed toward the stage, crew members wished him luck. He thanked each one, his calm presence seeming to spread a sense of ease throughout the building. The stage manager gave him a thumbs up as he took his position backstage, waiting for his cue. Through the curtain, he could hear the show's familiar theme music, the audience applauding, the hosts welcoming viewers to another episode. Nobody in that studio, from the newest intern to the most experienced producer, had any idea what was about to happen. They thought they were getting a straightforward celebrity interview, the kind they'd done 1,000 times before. What they were actually about to witness was a moment that would spark national conversation, divide public opinion, and become one of the most talked about incidents in daytime television history. But in that moment before his entrance, there was only anticipation. The good kind, the kind that comes before something everyone thinks will be wonderful. The cameras were ready, the lights were perfect, the audience was primed, and Keanu Reeves, the man who'd kept his dignity intact through decades of fame, was about to walk onto a stage that would test that dignity in ways no one expected. The conversation flowed naturally. He told a funny story about accidentally hitting a stunt coordinator during a rehearsal and feeling so guilty that he'd bought the entire team dinner for a week. The audience laughed, charmed by his self-deprecating humor. This was the Keanu people loved, the regular guy who just happened to be a movie star. Sarah Haynes asked about his preparation process, and he dove into a thoughtful discussion about character development. He talked about reading everything he could find about the world his character inhabited, about watching documentaries, about the importance of understanding motivation beyond what was on the page. It was the kind of insight that actors rarely shared in daytime television interviews, and you could see the hosts leaning in, genuinely interested. Then Whoopi brought up something that made the audience audibly react. She mentioned his habit of taking pay cuts so that projects could afford to cast other actors he wanted to work with. It was one of those Hollywood stories that had become legend, the kind of generosity that seemed almost impossible in an industry known for ego and greed. Keanu looked uncomfortable with the praise. "That's just practical," he said, trying to downplay it. "If you want to work with the best people, sometimes you have to make it financially viable. It's not charity, it's common sense." But the audience wasn't buying his modesty. The applause swelled again, and you could see him almost squirming in his seat, genuinely uneasy with being celebrated for something he clearly considered basic decency. Alyssa Farah Griffin shifted gears, asking about his motorcycle company and his love of bikes. This was safer territory, and Keanu relaxed again. He talked about the freedom of riding, the meditative quality of being on the road, the craftsmanship that went into building quality motorcycles. His passion for the subject was obvious, and it reminded everyone watching that he wasn't just an actor playing parts. He was a multifaceted person with deep interests beyond the film industry. The conversation touched on his earlier career, the roles that had defined different eras of his life. He spoke warmly about the Bill and Ted movies, about how those silly comedies had taught him not to take himself too seriously. He got more reflective discussing The Matrix, acknowledging how those films had changed his life, and touched on themes that people still debated decades later. "Do you think those movies predicted where we are now?" Sonny Hostin asked. "With technology, artificial intelligence, all of that?" Keanu considered the question carefully. He always did that, took a moment before responding to weightier topics. "I think the Wachowskis were incredibly prescient," he said. "But I also think the films work because they're about timeless questions. What is reality? What does it mean to be free? How do we maintain our humanity in systems that can dehumanize us? Those questions don't change, even if the context does." It was a thoughtful answer, the kind that made people remember why Keanu was more than just an action star. There was depth there, a genuine philosophical bent that he usually kept private. The host nodded appreciatively, and for a moment, it seemed like this would be one of those rare interviews that transcended the usual promotional cycle. Then the tone began to shift. It happened gradually at first, so subtle that maybe even the hosts didn't fully realize they were steering into different waters. One of them brought up his charitable work, the hospitals he'd donated to, the children's cancer foundations he'd quietly supported for years. "You do so much good," the host said warmly. "But you never talk about it. Why is that?" Keanu shifted slightly in his seat. "I don't think good deeds need publicity," he said simply. "If you're helping people to get recognition, you're helping for the wrong reasons." It was a perfectly reasonable answer, consistent with everything anyone knew about his character. But instead of moving on, the conversation stayed focused there. Another host jumped in, pressing the point about using fame as a platform, about the responsibility that comes with having millions of people who listen to what you say. "Don't you think celebrities have an obligation to speak out?" she asked. "You have this platform, this influence. Isn't staying silent a choice in itself?" You could see Keanu's expression change ever so slightly. The easy warmth that had characterized the interview so far didn't disappear, but it became more guarded. "I think everyone has to decide for themselves how they want to engage," he said carefully. "I've never felt that my opinions on certain things were more valuable than anyone else's just because I'm in movies." Whoopi tried to lighten things. "Well, we all know you're too humble for your own good," she joked, and the audience laughed. But the other hosts didn't take the hint. They seemed energized by this new direction, eager to push into territory that was more provocative than the standard celebrity interview fare. The questions kept coming, each one a bit more pointed than the last. They asked about social movements, about speaking out, about using privilege for change. And with each question, Keanu's responses became more measured, more diplomatic. He wasn't being rude or dismissive. He was simply trying to maintain boundaries that he'd held throughout his career. "I support causes privately," he explained at one point. "I donate time and money to things I believe in. But I've always felt that my job is to entertain people, to help them escape for a couple of hours. I don't think they're buying tickets to hear my political views." It was a reasonable position, one that many people shared. But in the current climate, where every celebrity statement became a lightning rod for debate, neutrality itself had become controversial. The hosts weren't satisfied with his answers. They kept circling back, rephrasing the same basic question. Why won't you use your voice? The audience was starting to sense the discomfort. The applause had become sporadic, uncertain. This wasn't the fun, uplifting interview they'd expected. Something had shifted, and even from their seats they could feel the tension building on stage. Keanu remained polite, but his body language told a story. He was sitting a bit straighter. His smile was tighter and his answers were becoming shorter. He wasn't angry, at least not visibly, but he was clearly done with this particular line of questioning. Then came the moment that would change everything. One of the hosts, perhaps not reading the room or perhaps reading it perfectly and deciding to push anyway, asked him point blank about a specific political controversy that had been dominating headlines. She framed it as a moral question, suggesting that silence on the issue was tantamount to complicity. The studio went quiet. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Keanu looked at the host for a long moment, then at Whoopi, then out at the audience. You could practically see him deciding how to respond, weighing his options, trying to find a way to navigate this moment with grace. What he said next would determine everything that followed. The morning sun hadn't fully risen over New York City when the first crew members arrived at the ABC studios. There was something different about this particular Tuesday. You could feel it in the air, in the way the production assistants moved with extra purpose, and how the stage manager kept checking his watch even though they were right on schedule. Today wasn't just another taping of The View. Today they were getting Keanu Reeves. Getting Keanu to agree to any talk show was like winning the lottery. The man was famous for avoiding the typical Hollywood publicity machine. While other actors would do a dozen interviews in a single day to promote their projects, Keanu might do 2 or 3 in an entire year. He wasn't difficult or demanding. He just valued his privacy in a way that seemed almost old-fashioned in an age where everyone shared everything online. The booking had taken 6 months of gentle persistence. Phone calls, emails, personal appeals. Keanu's team had turned down the invitation 3 times before finally saying yes. And even then, everyone involved knew he could change his mind right up until he walked through the door. That's just how he operated. No drama, no explanations, just a quiet, no thank you if something didn't feel right to him. The makeup room had been prepared with extra care. Fresh flowers, his favorite tea, comfortable chairs. Nothing over the top because that wasn't his style. One of the producers had done her homework, learning that Keanu appreciated simple gestures more than grand displays. There was a handwritten note thanking him for coming, a few magazines in case he wanted to read, and most importantly, complete privacy. No cameras, no phones, just a space where he could breathe before going on air. When his car pulled up to the studio entrance at 7:30 in the morning, a small group of early morning fans who had somehow figured out he'd be there began cheering. Keanu didn't rush past them like so many celebrities would. He stopped, smiled that genuine smile of his, and took a few moments to chat. He signed autographs, posed for selfies, and actually seemed to enjoy the interaction. One fan later posted online that he'd asked her about her day and really listened to her answer. That was classic Keanu.